Have you ever wondered who is the you that thinks your thoughts? Or where that voice in your head comes from, the one that comments on everything you do? And yes, even if it sounds a little crazy at first, that you that is trying to find the truth out there is actually the greatest obstacle to accessing it. Krishnamurti once said, "When the observer realizes he is the observed, understanding is born." This idea, as subtle as it is transformative, invites us to radically break away from the way we perceive ourselves. And we're not just talking about a mental trick or a pretty phrase for a spiritual social media post. We're talking about a shift in perspective that can turn your existence upside down, and maybe, for the first time, right side up. All of us at some point carry the weight of a suffocating self-consciousness, that feeling of being judged not by others, but by ourselves. You act, and immediately the voice appears. That was good, bad, appropriate. That internal narrator is like a sports commentator for a game he invented himself. And the most impressive thing is that, despite all that internal noise, we keep believing that this is who we are. But what if that voice is just background noise? What if the real you is the one who listens? Silent, attentive, always present, but never commenting. What would happen if you stopped trying to silence that voice and instead started observing who is listening? This video is a journey, not toward a new place, but toward a deep recognition. What you are seeking is what you are. The consciousness trying to understand the world is the same one manifesting the world. And in realizing this, maybe, just maybe, something silent awakens. Something that has always been there. Let's go together to the center of this enigma. And who knows, in the end, maybe you won't need answers anymore, because the questions will have dissolved. Most people who begin an inner path make a fundamental and understandable mistake. When they close their eyes and try to observe themselves, they believe that internal voice commenting on everything is the real observer. But it isn't. This confusion is so common that even experienced meditation practitioners spend years caught in it. It's like trying to silence a noisy room by shouting, "Silence!" The mind imitates itself so well it fools itself. That mistake has a name and a form. The internal commentator appears in three main ways: the narrator, the critic, and the cheerleader. It's that voice that tells you you're doing well or not during meditation. The one that narrates your day like a movie, that blames you when something goes wrong and praises you when you get it right. But above all, it's the one that's always trying to define you. And what's curious is that it feels separate from your daily life, like a serene entity floating above events. But that's just another performance. It's the ego dressed up as wisdom. Imagine for a moment that you're in a coffee shop. Background conversations, clinking cups, someone laughing loudly at a distant table. Now imagine that instead of focusing on your own coffee, you concentrate only on the voices around you. The internal commentator is that background noise you mistook for your essence. It seems like an observer, but it's just an echo. It doesn't see, it just reacts. The true observer, on the other hand, is mute. It doesn't think. It doesn't judge. It doesn't say this is good or bad. It simply is. It watches the internal commentator in action, notices its comings and goings, but it doesn't intervene. Not because it's indifferent, but because it already understood that none of those voices define you. As Krishnamurti wrote, the observer is the observed. And when that perception arises, separation disappears. The commentator is a product of the mind and therefore of your history. It feeds on your insecurities, desires, traumas, and memories. It is conditioned, shaped by childhood, by culture, by fears and dreams you don't even remember the origin of. And that's why it's so inconsistent. One day, it calls you a failure. The next, a genius. Always swinging, always unstable. That's why it's so hard to realize that voice isn't you. Because it sounds intimate. It knows your most secret pains. But intimacy is not identity. And the fact that something sounds familiar doesn't mean it's true. Revelation comes when, for the first time, you experience that strange silence between one thought and another. When, in the middle of a breath, everything stops for a second. In that brief, maybe imperceptible moment, you're not thinking, but you're aware. You're not commenting. You're just there, present. That is the observer, the one who witnesses the inner storm without getting wet, who sees fear without hiding, who sees love without clinging, who sees sadness without trying to push it away. It is in that space that true transformation happens. Because when you realize the commentator isn't you, you stop fighting it. And the strangest thing is, when you stop fighting, it also goes silent. And in that silence, you meet yourself. The most common mistake, then, is to search for the observer as if it were something separate, a refuge. But it's not a place. It's the very space where everything happens. And once it's recognized, there's nothing more to do. As Alan Watts said, you don't need to try to be yourself. You already are. If that sounds liberating, it's because it is. But it's also just the beginning. There is something deeply unsettling when you begin to realize that the most essential part of you has no voice, no opinion, passes no judgment. It just watches. The true observer doesn't need to convince, correct, or justify. It doesn't interfere. It doesn't try to control. It's just present, like the sky receiving all the clouds without ever becoming one. That observer is silence, but not a dead, empty silence. It is a living silence, full of presence. It is there when you feel rage, when you laugh at a joke, when you fall in love, or when you're afraid. It's right here, in this very moment, as you listen to these words. But it's not the one thinking about what's being said. It's the one seeing the thought reacting. This is where many people give up, because the mind, always anxious to define and control, wants to understand the observer. It wants to label it, name it, fit it into some theory to share at Sunday lunch. But the observer can't be captured in words, not because it's complex, but because it's too simple. It's so close, so fundamental, that the mind slips when trying to grasp it. Maybe that's why so many spiritual teachers contradict each other trying to describe it. For some, it's God. For others, the void. Some say it's the soul. Others, pure consciousness. Krishnamurti called it the state of choiceless awareness. The Upanishads call it Atman, the eternal self, the silent witness of all experiences. Buddhists speak of Rigpa, naked awareness beyond time. For Stoics like Marcus Aurelius, the secret was observing your own thoughts as if you were another person from the outside, with calm and clarity. In every tradition, the observer appears under a different name, but the experience is the same, a state of consciousness that sees everything without being confused with anything. And here's the beautiful part. When you realize the observer is silence, you discover that silence is not the absence of life, but its very essence. Noise, thoughts, emotions, those come and go. But the silence that perceives those movements remains. It's not something you create, it's something you recognize. Remember that moment when you were completely absorbed watching the ocean, or contemplating fire, or listening to a song that made you forget yourself for a few moments? That state of silent enchantment was the observer revealing itself, not as something separate, but as you, without the layers. And that's why it's universal. The observer watching your thoughts now is the same one that watched the thoughts of the Buddha, of a Tibetan monk, of a child playing alone, or someone lost in thought on the Tokyo subway. The experience that passes is unique, but the space observing it is the same. That silent consciousness is like a mirror. It reflects everything without being stained by anything. And the more familiar you become with that silence, the more you realize that everything you thought you were, name, story, desires, fears, are just temporary forms passing over the unmoving background of your presence. The mind shouts, the observer listens, the mind analyzes, the observer just sees. The mind wants to solve, the observer simply is. You don't need to try to be that observer. You already are. What you need is to recognize the moments when you get lost in the commentator and gently return to the silence that watches. And maybe in that process, you'll realize that what you've always been searching for, peace, freedom, meaning, was never out there. It was in the pause between one thought and the next, in the silence between two words, in the space between you and the world. The question is no longer, how do I find the observer? The question becomes, why do I keep forgetting it? There is a strange, almost unnameable experience that we've all had, but are rarely aware of. That feeling that despite everything changing in you over the years, your body, your tastes, your ideas, your certainties, something has stayed the same. The gaze behind the eyes, the silent presence that has witnessed everything from childhood to now. What is that which never ages inside us? That is where we begin to touch the timeless aspect of the observer. Think about it. When you were 5 years old and looked at the world, there was a sense of I am. Today, decades later, that sense of existence is still there, intact. You may have changed radically, but something inside you has remained the same. That something does not belong to time. It does not move with the seasons of life. It observes change, but does not change with it. Krishnamurti said the observer is the observed, because when you realize there is no separation between the one who sees and what is seen, you transcend duality. There is no longer subject and object, only consciousness witnessing itself in multiple forms. And at that point, every idea of identity dissolves. That consciousness has no name, no age, no past or future. It is the space where time occurs, but is not affected by it. The philosopher Alan Watts compared it to a jazz dance. There is no central conductor, only a living, fluid improvisation, with no fixed direction, but perfect coherence. The observer is that silence in the background of the music. This idea is so powerful, it cuts across cultures and eras. In the Upanishads, the sacred Hindu texts, it says, the inner self is motionless, but moves everything. It is far away, but also very near. It is within everything, but also outside of everything. The Christian tradition speaks of the kingdom of God within you. Zen Buddhism points to the original face before your parents were born. All these teachings are an invitation to recognize the eternal within the ephemeral. But why does this matter? Because recognizing that timeless aspect in you radically changes the way you deal with pain, attachment, and fear of death. When you realize that your essence is not trapped in time, you understand that what dies in you, your stories, your roles, your masks, was never truly you. It was the content, not the container. Most of our suffering comes from trying to preserve what is impermanent. We cling to memories, to people, to ideas of ourselves, like someone trying to hold water in their hands. But everything slips through, and suffering comes from trying to control the uncontrollable. The observer, on the other hand, tries to hold on to nothing. It simply watches, lets things pass, and remains. That is true freedom, not the freedom to do what you want, but the freedom to not be dragged by what you are not. The writer Eckhart Tolle, echoing this insight, said, "You are not the voice in your head, you are the one who hears it." And now comes something even more radical. The observer is not yours. It is not private property, not a spiritual identity to be conquered. It is the same in everyone. What changes is the content that passes, thoughts, emotions, experiences. But the space perceiving it all is one. That's why when you recognize the observer, something in you relaxes. The barriers fall. The separation between you and the other starts to appear as an illusion. The same silence observing in you is observing in the other. The same unchanging background behind your eyes is behind everyone's. It's what mystics call universal consciousness. You don't need to believe in this. It's not a matter of faith. It's a matter of seeing, of sitting in silence and observing until the truth becomes evident. And now, perhaps the most mysterious question arises, not as something to be solved, but as something to be lived. If the observer is not separate from what is observed, if the silence behind your thoughts is the same silence behind mine, then who or what are we really? Not in the surface sense of names, stories, achievements, or roles, but in that space before language, before identity, before even the impulse to ask. What if all our searching, striving, and suffering have always been guided not by a lack, but by an unspoken memory of wholeness, a silent knowing that beneath the noise, beyond the concepts, there is something vast and still, watching, not cold or detached, but infinitely intimate, closer than your breath, so close, in fact, that you can't see it, only be it. What changes when you realize you are not inside the world, but the world is inside you? That the sky, the stars, the music, the people you love, the moments you feared or cherished, they all appear and disappear within the screen of your awareness. And that this awareness, the one reading these words right now, is timeless. It does not come or go. It does not age or diminish. It simply is. And if this is true, if you are that awareness, then every face you see is a reflection. Every voice you hear is an echo. And every life you touch is not other, but self in disguise. There is no path to it because you cannot walk toward what you already are. You can only notice the ways you pretended not to be it. So, here we are, at the end of a text that is not really an ending at all. Words fade, questions dissolve. What remains is the stillness that has always been waiting beneath the surface, patiently, like an ancient friend. This is not something to cling to or to claim. It is something to remember again and again in the quiet moments, in the pauses between thoughts, in the gaze of a stranger, in the laughter of a child, in the last light of day sliding across the floor. Because the most beautiful revelation is not that the observer sees everything, but that it is everything. The dance and the dancer, the flame and the shadow, the question and the answer. And when this is seen, not as a theory, but as a living truth, what else is there to say? Nothing. And yet, everything begins again.